Thank you very, very, very much, Doc, for the very generous introduction. Let me also begin by thanking the organizers for getting me to join you for this Vikings Alumni Celebrity Lecture. When I received the invitation, I was a bit struck by the theme that I was given. I knew I was an alumnus of Mr. Sabaho, so that would qualify me to be here. I didn't know about the celebrity part. I never saw myself as a celebrity. When I think about celebrities in Ghana, Stoneboy or Shatawale, these are celebrities, or the footballers. I didn't know that a professor could become a celebrity. But I understand the context, and I accept to be here. I thank you very, very much for inviting me. It's also important that as I mount this rostrum, that I engage with my past. My past as a student in Mr. Sabaho. A past that, in my view, has contributed in no small way to make me the person that I have become. I enjoyed my time in Mr. Sabaho very, very much. I'm quite sure you all know the story of many of the things that we did in Sabaho. But the most important thing that one gathered from our being in Sabaho, it taught us being, at that time, the only hall that was co-educational, the only hall that had both male and female students. So we learned our place in life. We learned to live with women as our sisters and our friends. We learned that in Sabaho. It's something that was completely lost on other halls of residence. And it's something that today, I believe, is becoming more commonplace in universities. And I hope that as this spreads and makes the education of women a lot easier than it has been in the past, people will take advantage of it and prepare themselves for the future that they face. So I thank Sabaho for the opportunities he gave me, and I thank the organizers for inviting me here to come and share with you a few ideas. Of course, the origins of my thoughts in economics began when I was a student here. In those days, in the economics department of this university, quite a number of well-established Ghanaian professors who put us through all the requirements one needed to become a solid economist. And I'm quite sure that many of my peers would agree that we didn't do badly at all. So today, in view of the enormity of the challenges that we face as an African economy, I have agreed to talk about what it takes, or what it is like, or what it should be to manage an African economy during a pandemic. In doing this, the first message is that protecting the people from the virus is the most urgent and proper thing to do as an economic manager. I make this point because there's always been this controversy about whether we should be paying attention to the immediate things or think of how to protect the economy and so on. Protecting the economy for the future is very important. That's the second point. But of course, people have to live today, they have to survive today in order to be present for tomorrow. So it's important. But while keeping people alive for today, it's important that whoever is managing the economy keeps an eye on not allowing recovery to be delayed unnecessarily. After you suffer the pandemic, and some have died, there will be others who remain. They must eat. They must work. If everything has been destroyed in the meantime, there's going to be a huge challenge for them to find things to do and able to produce things and so on. So there are two things you're looking at. I mention this because sometimes, depending on people's interests, they focus on only one. It wasn't too long ago that we had debates whether we should simply be thinking about how to build the structures that would enable us to produce after the pandemic, as if that we knew when the pandemic was going to end, and as soon as it ended, they would go into a high gear and begin production. No, we didn't. So there are two things that we've got to do. We've got to survive for today through various interventions, and then we've got to think about recovery. So whatever decisions you take, you have two things in mind, today and tomorrow, which is basically what a normal economy should be like. But in the normal economy, you have a bit more time on your hands. You have more time to take decisions. You have more time to reflect. When you have a pandemic, you don't have that time. So that's the biggest difference. And we do talk about that. So in today's lecture, I'll introduce provide a bit of background to what we're discussing. And then I'll talk about how the pandemic has affected African economies. Then I will talk briefly about the Ghanaian experience. Then we begin to look ahead. What are some of the things that I can do? I'm not going to get into the political rhetoric of whether the Ghana government has done the right thing or not. I'm not going to get into it. But after all, from what I will say, you should be able to deduce what I think. So let's go on. Now, I begin by saying that developing economies are used to experiencing one shock or another from time to time. Any African economy, no matter how well developed, maybe South Africa being an exception, can be described, and we used to describe the good old days as fragile open economies. It means that anything coming from outside that is not favorable to it will lead to a shock. And sometimes things coming from outside that are favorable will then lead to some kind of positive impact on the economy. So when an economy is small, open, and quite fragile, there are many things that provide a shock to it. Quite often in the past, these shocks have come in the form of terms of trade shocks. So the price of cocoa drops drastically on the world market, and it becomes a big shock to the economy of Ghana because the anticipated revenues from cocoa exports are not going to be realized. That's a big shock to the economy. So the budget that you had prepared using a certain price of cocoa as your benchmark is not going to come in through. And that's a shock to the economy. And it takes time to get over it. There are many ways of financing what impact you do. You can either borrow or you can run down your reserves. So these kinds of shocks we are used to. In 1973, we had the oil price shock when the oil export nations around the world increased very significantly the price of oil, which meant for those who imported oil a huge shock to what they had to pay for their imports. So these types of shocks we know, and by now most African economies have developed some ways of dealing with these things. They know where to borrow if the price of cocoa should drop drastically, or the price of coffee or tea or gold or whatever. They know where to go. They know what to do, often. What we haven't learned properly is how to differentiate between different types of shocks. So the current pandemic that we have is a much bigger shock than any other shock an African economy has faced in the last century. And indeed, I should be able to go beyond that and say it's a much bigger shock than any economy in the world has seen. You know, during the Second World War, the industrial economies faced very significant shocks. Indeed, all economies face significant shocks. And they could tell how it was going to impact as a result of whatever decision they took on the war front. Today's pandemic has caused a shock around the world, which is a lot more severe and a lot more unpredictable in terms of effects. So nobody knows how long it is going to last, and nobody knows how it's going to affect various economies, the strongest of economies. Available data shows that Africa is still the region with one of the lowest incidents of infections and death in the world. We all know that. The number of people who have died in Africa is far less than in Europe and also in the US. So that's the situation that we have. And I show this graphically here. So we've seen that even though we are dying, we are not dying at the same rate as in the US or in other parts of the world. That may be a good thing, even though we also know that every life matters. So nobody should be dying, whether in small numbers or in large numbers, nobody should be dying. So it's our responsibility as people, our responsibility as people who govern ourselves to ensure that even with for small numbers, nobody is dying. Now, so what this table basically shows is look at the types of containment measures that we've seen in African countries since the pandemic broke. We have South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and so on. We know when the first cases were observed, South Africa, 5th March, and 1.5 weeks later, Ghana came on board, Kenya, Ethiopia, and so on. So the first cases that we know of were in South Africa. And of course, the number of cases that we've recorded per million people also provided there, and with South Africa in the lead. And then the number of deaths that have occurred, again, also provided there. And then we provide a list of the measures that were taken by the governments of these countries to contain the pandemic. Some states declared a state of emergency, some went into partial or full lockdown, curfew in places, the ban on large public gatherings, which almost every country did. The wearing of face masks became mandatory everywhere in Africa. The closing of borders or frontiers became very important. Social distancing, and then a ban on retrenchments, so on. So in Ethiopia, the government said you can't sack anybody or you can't let anybody lose their employment because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you've seen the wide variation across countries. There are those that did everything. There are those that did a few things, and so on. So the important question that we need to ask ourselves looking at this list here is what informed the choices made by governments? What informed the choices made? One was the need, the first point I made earlier in my introduction, the need to save lives. That was the most important thing. But as they thought about the need to save lives, they also thought about what will happen after we've saved those lives. And so these choices come with cost. And that's something that every economist must think about. They come with cost. If you choose to have a partial or full lockdown, it comes with a cost. Can the economy absorb it easily? And so I will talk briefly about that, for example. So while the direct effects in terms of contagion, fatality, and health expenditure appear to be low in Africa, the indirect effect in terms of economic impact has been huge for Africa. The economic impact stems largely from the response of various countries around the world to the pandemic. So we saw how in Europe and in other places in Asia and so on, countries began to close their borders. Airlines were beginning to, or were forced to stop flying and so on. The trade between nations became extremely challenging. So how Africa responded to that was largely driven by what was happening from place to place. There were places where banks did a lot of business, but with great difficulty. And so if our people had to deal with them, it became a challenge. The containment measures have been associated with severe productivity losses, severe disruptions to global supply chains, and slumps in demand for African exports. So we had things to export. But those that were exporting to were struggling. And because they were struggling, they couldn't find the space to import. So there were cancellations of orders, for example, and that was quite pronounced. If you take a country like Kenya, Kenya thrives on tourism. Kenya, as well as South Africa, Tanzania, these are countries that are driven to a very large extent by tourism. If your major export is tourism, and there's a pandemic, of course, if people can't travel to you, you're going to suffer. And that's how economies like Kenya, that thrive on tourism, thrive on flower exports and so on, horticultures, suffered. The demand for Ghana's cocoa wasn't that much affected, largely because of the nature of that. So what happened to African economies was largely driven by what was happening to their trading partners. Of course, uncertainties about the pandemic have led to declines in foreign direct investment and also aid with the overseas development assistance. These are things that have seen declines. The number of Europeans that walk into Ghana and want to invest in their factory, of course, went down largely because they can't travel to this place. And even if they wanted to travel here, they wouldn't want to receive them and work with them. Frontier closures, ban on large gatherings, social distancing, curfews, and so on. All of these had a very severe impact on economies. Schools have been closed, and for many of the private schools, it has meant teachers losing their jobs. It has meant informal staff losing their jobs or not being paid. There are parents who have removed their kids from school because they just can't afford to let them stay at home for that long a period. Many of the people who have suffered the most were from the informal sector. So just think about the plumber, or think about the mason who do these, what we call the by-day jobs. If you can't, because of lockdown, walk or travel to a workplace, of course you're going to lose your means of livelihood. Your livelihood means is going to disappear. And many are those who suffered in that way. So this is what the various world bodies that are responsible for monitoring economic performance have said in terms of outlook for Africa. So the IMF Regional Economic Outlook shows in the very clear terms that growth in Africa for 2020 will be minus 1.6%. The World Bank believes that growth in the region will also fall from, will be between minus 2.1, it's more grimmer than the IMF projection, minus 2.1 to 5.1% for 2020. The African Union Commission expects a negative growth. So basically, for all of these global entities or regional entities that measure, they are quite agreed that Africa's growth for 2020 will shrink and to be negative. So that's the important thing that we need to understand. Now, the South Africa is a good example of how sharp the drop is going to be. And we observe how net capital outflows, namely bonds and equities, have shrunk by $12.6 billion. That's 4.4% of the GDP of South Africa. It's completely disappeared. The real GDP contracted by 70.1% on a year basis. If you take Nigeria, the same contraction took place this time, about 6% for the second quarter of 2020. So there is ample evidence that African economies have struggled a lot through the pandemic. Now, what are the governments doing in order to help deal with the challenges that the economies are facing? In almost every country, they set up a COVID-19 fund. We have the same thing in Ghana, as we pay. And there's a youth employment scheme in Kenya. Some countries have provided unemployment insurance, social insurance, support for SMEs, tax holidays, food distribution programs, interest rate cuts, a waiver on mobile money charges, pay cuts for top officials, including the president, free water or electricity subsidies, cash transfer to all citizens, the waiver on import duties for pharmaceutical products. So you see a very long list of measures that various governments put in place in order to deal with the effects of the pandemic on people and on the economy. How do they decide which ones to go for? If you look at the unemployment insurance, South Africa is the only one here that provided unemployment insurance. It's not surprising because South Africa has one of the highest unemployment numbers, and these numbers were bound to get much worse with the pandemic. So it's not surprising that the government found a way out by providing insurance. The more important question that I see my South African colleagues trying to answer was whether this insurance has been effective in dealing with it. And there is a lot of debate about the effectiveness of that. The social insurance provided in South Africa and in Kenya. The SME bailout, we have it in Ghana here, providing tax holidays and so on. So were these effective in helping to stem the contraction that was taking place in the economy? Were these effective in providing a source of relief to households and companies that were struggling and so on? Cash transfer to all citizens, this was done in Nigeria. Was it effective? Were they able to provide the transfers as planned? Were they able to give it to households that needed it the most, and so on? So these are the things that come up when you begin to question. So of course, we talk about the Ghanaian experience, we talk about the near collapse of the exports, we talk about the collapse of many goods and services meant for domestic consumption. One of the areas that we often shed a lot of light on is the fact that these informal service providers suffered the most. Many were people who were working in households as house help. As a result of COVID, the owners of the house or the houses will say, look, why don't you stay with your family? When COVID ends, we'll bring you back, and probably that's the end of your employment. So these challenges were there. There were gardeners in various places who lost their jobs because the owners of the houses couldn't afford to let people come into their house and go on a daily basis. So we talk about the disruption in supply, as most firms are integrating global value chains. So today, if you look around the hotel industry in Ghana, the likelihood that in the next few months they will get back to the levels at which they operated before the pandemic is extremely low. Patronage has gone up considerably. So that's one sector that is taking a huge shock as a result of the pandemic, and will require some major intervention before it can revive itself. The emergence of new new underemployment following the closure of hotels, restaurants, and so on. I mentioned that already. And then the partial lockdown exacerbated what was already happening in terms of livelihoods. Livelihoods in Ghana were already severely challenged by the pandemic did towards worsen the situation. We don't have any figures yet on the agricultural production. What we anticipate is that since the rural parts of Ghana were far less hit than the large urban centers, the effects on food production is not going to be as severe as could have been or have been observed in other places. Production was also at a standstill. Many of the people who were involved in home construction couldn't go to work because of social distancing, couldn't go to work because of lockdown, and so on. So I said earlier that there's an ongoing debate about whether a lockdown is the most important thing that an African economy can pursue or not. There's a good number of economists, I must say, who believe that developing countries simply cannot afford a lockdown. Lockdowns came. We first heard of them in Europe, Germany, and then the UK and France and other places began lockdowns, where basically people were required to stay at home and not move out of a certain area. It is something that slowly also crept into Africa, and Ghana was one of the first African countries to impose a partial lockdown on Accra, Kaswa, Kumasi, and so on. The challenge in implementing a lockdown properly is, apart from the difficulty in the difficulties that arise when people cannot travel from their homes to go to work, and because they can't work from home. That challenge is one that cannot be ignored, and it has a huge cost on the economy. So when you think about the fact that you work in a hotel but you can't go to work, you work in a construction but you can't go to work, you work in the hospital but you can't go to work, well, there are those who are exempted from the lockdown and so on, but there are others who are affected by it. All of these have a huge impact on the economy. When you force truck-trailer vehicles to carry half of the load that they normally would carry, or taxis to do the same thing, there's a cost, both to the individual investor or the owner, and then to the economy itself. Can African or developing countries afford the cost of these lockdowns? It's a huge debate that many are still grappling with. Those who said, no, we can't afford it, they proposed other things. Now look, you try and maintain your social distancing, try to enforce the wearing of masks, try to enforce the various other protocols that you can put in place. But when it comes to lockdown, be very, very careful. Because the likelihood that when you impose a lockdown, no matter how long it takes, the likelihood that it is going to affect your ability to rebuild the economy is much, much bigger than any of the other things. Remember I said at the beginning that you are doing two things: keeping people alive, and then ensuring that in the medium to long term, you can rehabilitate the economy and then try to bring it back to where it was before the pandemic. And lockdown, it's argued, makes that a lot more difficult, especially the longer it takes. And you don't know how long the pandemic is going to last. So before you impose a lockdown, be very, very careful. Weigh the costs, weigh the benefits. If the benefits exceed the costs, then you may do it. Did we do that? That's something that we got to think about. It's obvious that with or without a lockdown, the livelihoods of large sections of the society would have been compromised. The fear is about whether the impact on the vulnerable groups will be longer lasting or not. So, many people have lost incomes. There are many people who make investments that they will never probably be able to get any major returns on. There are people from groups, whether they are KIA or they are other forms of informal operators who have been affected by the pandemic, who have been affected because of reduced demand for their services and for their goods and so on. These are they are still suffering. They are still suffering because today it's not everybody who can afford to call a plumber and say, come to my house and do some work for me, because they are afraid of what virus they may carry into your house. So there are these vulnerable groups. How do we deal with them? When the pandemic came and we had a lockdown, we provided emergency support for KIA. We provided support, provided free water and free food to people. Can we afford to continue, even though they may not have come out fully from the situation? Of course, it's a cost that we got to deal with. What's the best way to assist those vulnerable sections? What's the best way to assist them to think of new ways of earning their livelihoods? Should government borrow more to spend on saving livelihoods? Should government look for more aid for the purpose? So these are the sort of questions that an economic manager must be asking himself or herself. These are the questions. What's the best way? We saw some countries provide social insurance, unemployment insurance. We didn't. Should we have introduced social insurance or some other insurance? We have what we call the livelihoods against poverty, providing people the support through various social protection measures. It's very, very important. Is it possible to use these much more effectively to provide some assistance to the more vulnerable? We've seen how we've used various ways, either borrowing domestically or borrowing from outside to provide support to different groups and so on. We provided support through electricity subsidies. We provided support through water subsidies and so on. Are these the best ways to use the resources that we have? These are questions that we will be grappling with. But we argue it should not be a battle of health versus economics. It should not be one of it. Should these people be allowed to die and these ones not allowed to die and so on? Or should it be a question of let's provide more for the health challenges that we are facing, and doing very well that the economic, or thinking that the economics does not really matter. It should not be reduced to that. So we argue in our paper that the use of face mask coverage should be taken very seriously. So let's do what's important for the health side. Let's do what's important to survive. An application of basic hygiene, for example, is proper. The use of alcohol-based antivirals is something that must continue at a much larger scale, that, especially now that we know that the pandemic is not at all disappeared. Social protection is essential. We need to borrow if we have to, or take grants if the need, if it arises, to save livelihoods. And then you talk about the need to have social protection in a more structured way. One point that I believe strongly, and I have always emphasized, is the fact that when you provide social protection to different vulnerable groups, considering the level of development, the stage of development that we've reached, it's important that we target. I don't believe, I've never believed that providing social protection on a universal basis is the right thing to do. I don't believe it because there will be so many leakages. I don't believe it because you can't protect, you can't police the whole system. And so the likelihood of leakages out of that is extremely high. People that should not be getting it will be getting it. And the cost gets bigger and bigger. So proper targeting of benefits and the social protection is extremely important. And that's something that, of course, it means that in good times you build the infrastructure and the social network for doing that. But something that if you try to do only in the time of the pandemic, you very likely will make the wrong decisions. So, looking ahead, have African governments made the right choices in containment intervention measures, and what influenced their choices? I gave you the long list of different things that we went through or we experienced. Were these the best decisions? What we did, or what has been done in most African countries, are replicas of what everybody else was doing, whether in Europe or in so there was nothing there that was uniquely African. There was nothing there that was uniquely African. And so we talk about the fact that when the crisis hit, we didn't even have the time to reflect on what is different in Africa, and therefore how should we, did we think about the way we organize our housing and the way we organize our transportation that make it extremely challenging for people to keep a social distance. And therefore, if that was going to be a problem, there will be other ways in which you can get similar results but less confining. We didn't have a time to reflect on those things, and we advocate important the need for us to think about and spend money on developing those intervention measures that would allow us to. I was very happy that when it became obvious that the challenges to maintain a lockdown were rising, that Ghana was one of the first in the world to remove a 3-week lockdown. We're able to say, yeah, I think we've gotten to the point where we no longer need a lockdown, and we're courageous enough to do that. We talk about the fact that as a result of the challenges that various countries have faced, it's going to be extremely difficult for us to attract the kind of resources that we become used to, whether it's foreign direct investments, whether it's portfolio investments, remittances, and so on. Remittances are likely to go down. They will go down largely because the people who do the remittance, who said that these remittances are also struggling as a result of the challenge that they face in these countries of origin. So we will see before the pandemic broke, revenues were declining, inflows were declining in some places. Private savings had some challenge. It's not going to get any better from what. So if you're not going to see better inflows, how are you going to deal with the economic challenges that have arisen? That's what, of course, countries have options. Instead of waiting for FDI to come, you may go and borrow, as Ghana does. You may borrow from external sources, or you may also borrow from your banking system. So these are the challenges that we face. With these sources, in fact, the governments will have to decide whether to borrow or not to borrow. It's not as simple as that. It's not as simple as saying to borrow or not to borrow. Can you borrow in a manner that all the borrowing that you are doing is used for things that will lead to solid, well-structured returns that would allow you to repay? Or you borrow and use it to promote consumption at a level that is not required. So there are choices to be made. We as Ghanaians need to ask ourselves, when we borrowed, have we used it effectively? When we borrowed, have we used it for the things that will support the economic's recovery within the shortest possible time? There are few options that remain, and the pandemic is not likely to disappear for some time. Even though today we know about the story of vaccines, the vaccines are appearing, but they are not going to be costless. The vaccines also will cost a lot of money. Are we ready to invest something in the development of vaccines? Or are we in a position to import vaccines? Or are we simply going to wait for the WHO to work with others to find ways of giving Africans? This is a huge area in which this is a university that we should be thinking about how to do the kinds of research that would allow us to produce and develop vaccines a lot cheaper than it is possible. The science behind it is quite well known. It's a matter of training people and supporting them. Are we as Africans, knowing that there will be another pandemic in the not too distant future, are we ready to invest so that we will know how to develop vaccines and produce them more cheaply? There are a number of steps that are being taken. The governments are borrowing left and right all over the region. The biggest problem that African countries are going to face when the pandemic is out is how to repay the amounts that they are borrowing. So we talk about Ghana, we talk about South Africa, we talk about Ethiopia, we talk about Uganda, and all these countries. Everybody is borrowing, some far more than others, and all of them will face very significant repayment challenges. And that's something that we got to think about. So we describe in the paper how foreign borrowing impacts in various countries. Domestic borrowing is also taking place, and these are the things that we need to look out for. In the medium term, we say the emphasis should be on boosting domestic demand as well as exports. For the stimulus program be enough to boost domestic demand? Should we see government spending more? I'm yet to see any evidence that government spending more necessarily boosts domestic demand. I'm yet to see the evidence. What should be the considerations for the informal economy? What is it that will make it a lot more worthwhile for people in the informal sector to come back to the levels that they were operating at before the pandemic? It's something that I believe many economists will be working on. In the end, there's no easy way out of the dilemma posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Economic managers have to think about both the immediate situation and the medium to long-term requirements. As they borrow in order to bring back life to some parts of the economy, they should always think about it. Can we do the repayment at the appropriate time? Can we do this without any major impact on other sectors of the economy? Clearly, a more robust and diversified economy would have many more options. People always said, oh, but you see, look at these European countries that were more industrialized and more diversified. They've suffered even more than us. That's very true. They've suffered even more than us. But their likelihood of coming back is also far, far higher than us. Because of the diversified economy, because of the fact that incomes come from many different sources in those economies. Even though they've taken a huge passion from the pandemic, the likelihood that they will return to where they were before is much higher than for us. So these are the points that I will share with you. Drawing attention to some of the challenges that we face, what we've done, how we've done it, what the likely implications for the future, the medium to long term will be, and how we may face them. The kinds of questions that we should be asking ourselves, the kind of research that we need to be doing as universities, and so on. I've tried to draw your attention to them. Thank you very much.